Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let's get going with yet another very important topic for discussion, which is the distinction between tax and fees. If we were to identify and um, acknowledge this difference between tax and fees, um, before doing so, in terms of how the judicial interpretation goes, how conceptually they do have convergences, and yet, in terms of what they tend to achieve, differ. Let's just do a quick round of thinking around. Have you ever come across any kinds of such examples? Anything that may come to your mind when we talk about a tax and a fee? Okay, first example, fees could be something that the government may charge for providing a service, such as registering a company. Yes, registration fees, uh, which you can think about. Any other example? Fees may be optional as opposed to tax. Yes, again, a very good point. Any other kinds of fees that you might have yourself paid or like may have been subjected to? Court fees. Okay, court fees, we will
Fees
keep it
generally,
out. Education fees. Okay. Anything
ma'am,
else? Yeah, you're
fees
written there.
generally for a particular purpose or for a particular use. Tax is like for general purpose, like the government can use the money collected through tax for anything. For the
Mm-hmm.
fee, they need to use it for a particular purpose.
Okay, yes, yes. Again, a very critical distinction being pointed out. Fees is something which you use it for a specified purpose. Tax, on the other hand, government can collect it and apply it for any purpose that it wants. Entry fees, that's again a item which is being put across as a example. Okay, see, let's just dwell further on these concepts as is rightly coming through your examples as well as the attributes that you are identifying. It is somewhere conceded that both tax and fees is for the purposes of this public revenue kind of generation is something especially in the public domain is something which comes through a state authority, right? A government is the one which will be imposing the tax, so that the private authorities, let's say like this tuition fees or education fees, is something which we keep that bit out of this purview. That's something which is totally within the private domain. When we do understand the difference between tax and fees, is also, as was rightly pointed out, that the tax is understood as a part of a common burden which all of us share. Government can use the proceeds from that collections for any purposes that it wish to apply it to. Whereas when it comes to fees, there is some kind of a special purpose which is served, or some kind of a benefit, or maybe some special advantage which flows on account of the payment of that fees. It was also in one of the response pointed out that usually fees is something which is optional in nature, whereas tax is a compulsion. When we understand fees as being optional, the relation is that, all right, if you want to avail that kind of a privilege, or if you want to receive that kind of advantage, then you pay up the fees. Otherwise it's perfectly fine, right? So if I could draw that entry tax for example, The entry tax, in the sense that, see, if you are wanting to use that express highway, then the toll that you pay can be, in that sense of terms, be understood as a fee, because only if you want to use that particular expressway that you will pay the fee, and you will get that advantage or that benefit of using that, shortcut, or that, uh, you know the good quality of the road. Otherwise, if you do not want to pay that fees, then the national highways are very much available for you. uh, Coming to this kind of the judicial interpretation, you have those very classic kind of cases from which we derive this conceptualizing of tax, right? We had seen the definition of taxation comprised in Article 366, Clause 28, which we had seen in the earlier class, but that is not really leading us into what attributes do we, identify in the tax. Hence, the judicial kind of the development of this definition becomes helpful. Amongst the most classic kinds of definitions that you will come across whilst in litigation or even in research or otherwise is the definition offered by Chief Justice Latham in Matthews versus Chicory Marketing Board. A tax is a compulsory exaction of money by public authority for public purposes, enforceable by law, and is not payment for services rendered, right? So this is the definition which captures all these points which you all were making a little while ago. One, that it is understood as a compulsory exaction of money. Second, that it is being put in place by a public authority for public purposes enforceable by law, and it is not a payment for services rendered. If we were to therefore break this down, it essentially gives us the, the attributes of a tax, that there is no special benefit which can be claimed as a matter of right. That quid pro quo that we understand to exist cannot be claimed as this kind of a right on account of making that payment, right? We had seen this even in the earlier part of our course, where we were saying that it's very critical to tax that even if one is receiving some benefit, it's like all of us pay the taxes and we know that we get all these public goods and services and infrastructure, but it is not as a matter of a quid pro quo. That we all pay taxes as a part of common burden, and in most occasions the payment that we make depends upon our ability to pay, right? uh, this kind of an attribute to the tax uh, would essentially mean that taxes are devoid of any kind of a quid pro quo, shared as a part of a common burden, so that even if we are receiving some advantage, it is merely incidental to, you cannot really demand that kind of a services when it comes to payment of taxes. Another essential attribute which is also somewhere appended to this common burden thing is that whatever payments that we make, it essentially gets the proceeds which are collected, gets deposited in this kind of a general fund, and from that general fund, right, the consolidated funds which are created, from that then the expenditures are incurred. However, we do have within this realm earmarked taxes as well, which we popularly know as a cess. So whenever the taxes are earmarked, the proceeds of those kinds of taxes are to be used only for the special purpose which it is meant to serve, right? So we were using the examples of the Krishi Kalyan cess, or even the Swachh Bharat cess, right? Those falls within this kind of a range of earmarked taxes. Uh, as against this kind of understanding of tax, when we come to deriving the meaning of a fee, what we have in place is number one, that the fees is normally understood as a payment for a special benefit or a privilege. An element of quid pro quo on most occasions exist in a fees. Fees can be regulatory or compensatory in nature. It is mostly based on the benefit principle and not on the ability to pay. And the fact that the fees, can be regulatory or compensatory in nature, nevertheless carves out a further kind of a subsetting therein, whereby since it is compensatory in nature, there will be a quid pro quo, but oftentimes regulatory fees are again devoid of quid pro quo. Hmm? Fees can be regulatory or compensatory in nature. Compensatory fees will always have that element of quid pro quo, but regulatory fees often are devoid of that kind of a quid pro quo. Just a moment, there was some observation in the chat box. See it. Okay. Uh, the attributes of the tax which we were discussing, they seem to resonate more with direct tax and less with the indirect taxes. See, when you talk about taxes, whether direct or indirect, even when you are speaking about indirect tax collections that happens, all these attributes can equally apply even to indirect taxes, right? Of course, there is one specific digression that you are making in terms of when you speak about indirect taxes. Let's say GST, for example, is that it does not take into account your ability to pay. That's the difference which you create over there. So that when it comes to personal taxes that we pay, therein we have those slabs and it is progressive in nature, and hence you take into account the ability to pay. When it comes to GST, or even for that purposes, okay, I'll not use the corporate tax as an example, not a good example. When you talk about these indirect taxes, they are flat, right? Which means they do not take into account whether or not you can shell out that amount of money. If you want to purchase that good, the price which you are paying will include that kind of a tax irrespective of your ability to pay, right? And hence also a charge that indirect taxes being flatly applied are regressive in nature. But that's the only difference, but otherwise indirect taxes are also tax. uh, when we come to the fees, right, especially this kind of difference, fees which are compensatory and fees that are regulatory uh, are also given this kind of an elaborate meaning to themselves. Just to clarify, whenever fees is charged for rendering specific services, a certain element of quid pro quo must be there between whom? Between the services rendered and the fees charged, so that whatever is the fees which is being imposed, let's say for example some kind of a license fees, it commensurates with the cost of rendering the services, although exact arithmetical equivalence is not expected. I will just come back to this point which is being made. See, when one is dealing with fees in general and more particularly compensatory fees, whatever is the fees that is charged, one one will be able to recognize some specific service, and the quid pro quo is between deferring these kinds of costs of rendering that service and the amounts which are being collected, right? So more than often you will find that the fees which will be imposed will be able to cover the costs of providing that services. Now you here do not have to make this exact kind of a matchup that all right, 1 crore collected, 1 crore spent towards the cost. That kind of exactitude is not required, but it should more or less be, uh, around that same amount. License fees, on the other hand, at times, and fees in general, can also be regulatory in nature. Whenever any kind of activities, etc., are required to be regulated or controlled, then one can always impose it with a fees. Now, in such kind of instances, because you are trying to regulate or control some activity, at times it is possible that there is no specific service which is being rendered to the payer of that fees. An element of quid pro quo, therefore, can often be absent from these kinds of regulatory fees, but a very essential qualifier for a regulatory fees is that such a fee cannot be excessive in nature. Why? Because the moment a regulatory fees, which is as such devoid of any quid pro quo, becomes excessive in nature, it no longer remains a regulatory fees, it becomes a tax. Would you appreciate this statement? Right? So when you have something like a learner's license, right? Something like a license fees being paid to get the a license to practice as a lawyer, right? The bar council's fees. Um, the other kinds of licenses, let's say to open a shop. Let me come back to it. What we are saying is, in general, compensatory fees will have a quid pro quo, and as a result, it will commensurate with the costs of providing the service. However, when you walk into the realm of a regulatory fee, something which is meant to control an activity or to regulate the activity, most of the times you may encounter a situation where a regulatory fees does not have a quid pro quo to itself. Now, because it is devoid of such a quid pro quo, an essential qualifier is that such a regulatory fee cannot be excessive in nature. That is, if such a fees is found to be augmenting revenues, then it will stop being a regulatory fees, it will become a tax. And why is it so? Because see, even in tax, we had seen, remember, in our very first class where we were assigning the goals of taxes, one of the goals that we had identified there was that taxes can also regulate. And remember, taxes are also devoid of quid pro quo. So if you were to then make a comparison of an impost, one which is being nomenclatured as a regulatory fee, but in essence is excessive in nature, devoid of any quid pro quo, and is also now augmenting the revenues for you, chances are that it is a tax being imposed in the garb of being a regulatory fees. Okay, what are the kinds of regulations envisaged through a regulatory fees? How does regulatory fee satisfy the purposes of requirement of a fees? Isn't it very general? See, there is a whole lot of leeway which is being given to your public authorities to operationalize themselves, right? All these kinds of fees which are put in place, and mind you, this distinction again in practice might not even be so watertight. So you can have an impost which is serving both the purposes of being compensatory as well as regulatory in nature. Think of it in terms of let's say this kind of a fees that you have to pay to practice as a lawyer. Now, that fees will be charged to you on an annual basis. Partly, this will serve the purposes of compensating all those who are practicing law, in the sense that it will be ensuring that you do have this kind of partly a control over who is getting into the practice. Partly, it will also oversee and process that those who do not qualify get don't get this kind of an entry into this field. Partly, it also ensures, so in that sense of terms, it is compensating you by ensuring that your field is safe, and other players who are from outside do not step in. So you will find this kind of a combination of the fees and the purposes which it serves, which can be partly compensatory, partly regulatory. Even the kind of fees, let's say, which you go and pay to get your license, right? Driving license, so to say. This kind of an understanding can be extended even for getting driving license. Why? Because then it will compensate you for the services provided, in terms of, like, there will be an inspector who will be there, who will test your driving skills. They will ensure at the same point of time that all those who are on the roads are properly regulated, and nobody who doesn't know driving are out there to harm others, on the road and out there. So you do have all these kinds of combinations which are often at play. The the very essential critical point in here is, if you are finding that something is being imposed on you which is excessive, it is not commensurating with the cost, and which is also not providing you any quid pro quo, then you can very well challenge that it is a tax. And then we all know that in order to impose a tax, you will need the authority of the law, which means you will go back and make all those kinds of scrutinies, whether you had that power to impose that levy also at all or not. See, these kinds of impositions and disputes that we run into, we often run into them after the impost is already levied, and then subsequently getting challenged in the courts of law, right? So we tend to work backwards, and and not forward in that sense of terms as litigators. Of course, for the governments, when they want to come up with all these kinds of taxes and fees, they will somewhere have to make those kinds of checks. But because there is this kind of a blurring which is possible, you might have this tendency to pass off these kinds of impositions in the name of fees, whereas in a sense they may be tax. We will, throughout our discussion, keep picking these kinds of instances where there were these kinds of challenges brought forth to clarify this distinction further. This kind of a qualifier is something which is also flagged by the courts more than often, to say that the authority collecting the fees must show that the services which are rendering in lieu of fees is for some kind of a special benefit or not. You have these um, understandings of fees, the elements of fees, which the courts have been very consistently putting through. Element of quid pro quo must be established. Arithmetic exactitude not required. Predominantly, the authority collecting the fees must show that you are rendering the service, which is some special benefit to the payer of the fees. Now, this kind of quid pro quo towards the one who is paying the fees and the one who is receiving the benefit of it uh, has also somewhere been moved away from. We will just come to that kind of a development in the whole concept about fees as well. But just to put across why exactly this distinction is crucial, in our constitutional framework, this distinction between a tax and a fees is critical for the reason that When we look at these kinds of the entries with which we have been engaging since past, a couple of classes, what we come across is that you have those dedicated taxing entries. See, last class we saw how the list are arranged, right? You have general entries, you have taxing entries, and you also have a separate entry for fees. Hmm? When you refer to the union list, entry 96 refers to the fees. Fees in respect of any matter in the said list, not including fees taken in any court. So court fees are not to be understood in the way in which we are trying to engage with the concept now. Similarly, state list also comprises of those general entries, taxing entries, and entry 66, which provides for fees. Now, it is very essential that whereas power to tax is confined to those particular taxing entries specified in these lists, and that a general entry cannot be invoked for the purposes of imposing a tax, fees can very well be charged as incidental to the exercise of the legislative power on general entries, right? So when you have this entire list which is set out, general entries, taxing entries, entry for the fee. If a public authority comes up with a tax, it has to get itself identified in one of the taxing entries. But when it comes to imposition of fees, that stringent requirement has not been placed on the public authority. Fees can also be charged as incidental to the exercise of the legislative power on general entries, right? So let's say if you have something like railways, for you to impose taxes with anything pertaining to railways or passengers or goods, you will need to identify a taxing entry. But when you want to impose a fees, you can very well impose a fees with respect to any of those general entries, whether it is railways, whether it is land, whether it is sanitation, whether it is health, right? So that kind of a leeway is given for the imposition of fees. And therefore, this distinction becomes very critical, because otherwise, what may happen is that a public authority who finds oneself limited by the virtue of absence of those taxing entries might want to package that imposition in the nature of fees and pass it off, as a levy. And that's where these kinds of scrutinies becomes critical. Okay. One question or comment in the chat box. Just a moment. In the Tax Federation versus Union of India case, was the tax not levied based on a general entry? No. See, when you have all these kinds of taxes which are being posed, right? Whether professional tax, whether service tax, whether any some such kind of expenditure tax, you need a taxing entry, or then you get it under the residuary entry, right? Which includes taxes as well. So you need to have a taxing entry to impose a tax. But fees is something which is like very malleable. You can, pass it off. Why? For the reason that fees will have a quid pro quo. One, it is not going to pinch the pockets of those who are paying it, because the understanding is that it will have a quid pro quo, right? One, it will commensurate with the services which are being offered, and the payer will also receive the benefit out of having paid that kind of fees. Um, so you do have this distinction which is critically being placed in the constitution itself. Whole range of cases which has been making this kind of uh, you know um, a range of disputes which have kept coming before the courts to determine the nature of the levy, right? And to determine whether it was a tax or a fees. Now, when it comes to this kind of the conceptualizing of fees, uh, classical understanding of it was um, okay, let me just finish this and I'll then go to the chat box. There's some query, I'll just address it in a while. A classical understanding of the concept of fees as we are seeing it was quid pro quo between the payer and the authority charging it. The cost of it, the levy commensurates with the costs of the services being rendered, something special going to the benefit of the payer of that fees. Now, this classical understanding that when we pay the fees, we are the ones who will be receiving some special benefit or advantage out of that payment was somewhere getting diluted, and the development which subsequently followed was that this traditional perception that actual quid pro quo for the fees must be received by the one who is the payer of that fees has undergone a sea change. The distinctions which continue to remain between tax and fees was that tax is a part of a common burden, fees for the payment of some special privilege, right? But even if there is this kind of a special privilege which may not be going only to the one who has paid that fees, but it is someone going to the for the general benefit of everyone, and this particular payer as a class of that recipient of that general benefit is receiving the services, that is also perfectly fine, right? So you have already made that movement in the jurisprudential understanding of the fees from the point which you are saying that the one who paid the fees must receive the benefit of it, and the quid pro quo therefore was so direct. From that point, you have now reached a position where you are saying that this relationship need not be direct, and a mere casual relationship is also enough. It is not now necessary to establish that those who pay the fees must receive direct benefit of the services rendered for which the fees is being paid. If one who is liable to pay receives general benefit from the authorities levying the fee, the element of this kind of a quid pro quo is satisfied. In other words, the fact that others who are paying the fees are also benefiting from it will not detract the payment from the character of a fee. Is this falling in place? Hmm, right? Okay. Let me look at the chat box. There was some query over there. Okay. Now, this kind of the development of the concept of fees, therefore, is also critical in the way in which now we will be able to challenge the levy. Let me use this case in point just to give you an example of how this makes a difference and that excessiveness or otherwise which one is trying to put across. Not so much for the excessiveness, but in terms of determining the distinction. Uh, the Sikandrabad Hyderabad Hotel Owners Association is the case in point. You had here in this matter petitioners challenging an increase in the license fees for a trade license for running lodging houses, hotels, restaurants by the municipality of Hyderabad. Now, this is that very typical kind of regulatory compensatory fees, conundrum, where uh, the municipality insists that if you want to run a hotel or a restaurant, it can't be that you open a shop, suddenly at one point of time and start running it. You will have to take permissions. You will have to take the license, pay the license fees, adhere to all those kinds of regulations which have been placed in the Municipal Corporation Act. For example, you will maintain cleanliness, fire safety, you will have inspectors visiting your premises, there will be proper ventilation, you will put out the board, right? All those kinds of regulations which one will have to follow. And one will have to keep renewing the license over a period of time. Uh, and this is the way in which you are trying to regulate all those who are running these kinds of restaurants and hotels within the municipal area. Plus, you are also somewhere compensating them by providing cleanliness service and other kinds of activities which you do. Now, when this kind of a fees was being levied, over the period of time, they had increased the license fees. So first in 1981, then thereafter in 1992, right? And this amount kept increasing. Now, it is this increase in the amount of the license fees which is being challenged by the petitioners. They argued that there is no particular quid pro quo that we are receiving by making the payment of this fees. uh, these increases in the fees being devoid of a quid pro quo are therefore in the nature of tax, and the procedure that you had to follow whilst imposing a tax were not followed in this case. Hence this increase which has been made needs to be shot down. Now, the procedure in the municipal act to impose the new taxes, is that your commissioner will then notify those kinds of taxes in the newspaper. They will call for some kinds of objections, provide some hearing. It will go to the house, then they will pass it, right? So there's a lot of cumbersome, technicalities and procedures which needs to be followed when you are imposing a tax. But for fees, there was no such thing. The petitioners here in the Secunderabad Hyderabad hotel owners case are arguing that this increase is not bringing any special advantage or benefit to them, because they claimed that, look, these kinds of sewerage facilities or other kinds of garbage removal facilities which is being claimed to be provided to us is any which ways what the municipal corporation does for the general public at large. By making us make increased payment to the license fees, we are not being given any kind of a special advantage or privilege, and hence this increase should not be allowed. This is where one comes into and brings all those classical understandings of the fees and tries to put across that point that, look, whenever you are receiving this kind of a benefit or advantage, whereas you had started out with a position that the one who is paying the fees must be the one who receives the benefit, and that it should go into the dedicated kind of a fund, because only then you will be able to demonstrate that, look, this is the payment is the costs are being deferred, and there is this kind of a commensurate collections which is in accordance with the cost that one is incurring. All these kinds of stringent requirements have been diluted. What you do have is this movement away from classical understanding. Even when there is a broad and a generic correlationship which exists, this is something which needs to be acceptable. In this specific matter, the municipal corporation actually came up with all their budgeted spending and the spendings in the past to demonstrate that, see, the license fees which they have increased is to defer and to cover all those kinds of costs that they were incurring. They actually showed the figures that, look, these are the kinds of collections that we are making from these license fees as against the kind of expenditure we are incurring to hire the inspectors, to provide these garbage facilities, to ensure that all these hotels and even others who are coming in competition comply with all those regulations, right? So there is an administrative cost which needs to be covered. And in fact, the figures demonstrated that what they were expending, what the corporation was expending, was much more than what they were actually collecting from these hotel owners, right? And therefore, the court declined to hold these levy, the increase in the fees, as a tax. The court went on to hold that the license fees which is being charged is a regulatory cum compensatory fees in nature. It is not a tax. If it is not a tax, then all those arguments which the petitioners were making, that oh, you should have called for public objections, there should have been a hearing which had to be arranged, you are supposed to give us due notice and time for hearing, all those kinds of arguments cannot be upheld. Why? Because the levy which is being imposed is in the nature of a fees. What about that quid pro quo part? In fact, it was being argued by the corporation, and that was something which was also conceded by the court, that these eateries and hotels and restaurants create larger amounts of garbage than an individual household would. And hence, the kind of services which are provided to them within these kinds of collections that they are making is something which is a kind of an advantage or privilege which others are not getting, right? And consequently also, there is the fees which is being collected, it is not excessive in nature, they are not augmenting the revenue, rather corporation says that we are in a deficit, we are collecting a very small part, and hence this stands as a fees, not as a tax. Let me take a look at the chat box. Mm. In compensatory fees, is it necessary that the fees must be proportionate to the benefit received, or it can be whatever the government wants? See, in compensatory fees, it has to be proportionate to the benefit that one is receiving, right? Because you are trying to cover your costs. It cannot be excessive in nature. So, more or less, when you are, as a public authority, when you say that you are compensating by virtue of collections, the burden is on you to prove that, all right, it is something which is more or less in sync with the costs that you are incurring, right? It cannot be excessive in nature. Mostly compensatory fees, you will find they are not excessive. Hmm. Um, can an example of a casual benefit that is being received, okay, this might be a little confusing. Okay, let me just use this example to test your knowledge. Let's just think over it. There is a levy of cess under the Andhra Pradesh Rural Development Act of 1996. Hmm. Uh, who are being imposed with this cess? Firms and individual traders who were engaged in the business of rice milling were subjected to a 5% cess whenever they purchased the goods. The statement and the object, the statement of objects and reasons of the act read thus. It is observed that the development in the rural areas in the state has not been accelerated due to paucity of funds. The government are of the view that there is an imperative need to provide financial assistance for the development of rural areas in the state by creating infrastructure facilities so that the economic activities in the rural areas will increase and thereby contribute for the growth of the economy. With a view to generating funds for the purposes of the development of rural areas, it is considered desirable to levy a cess and so on and so forth. The fund, as the statute provided, shall be applied for the purposes specified thus. Number one, to provide and accelerate comprehensive rural development, including the construction of rural roads and bridges. to augment storage facilities for storing agricultural produce and for maintaining and strengthening of public distribution system. Who will be paying this cess? The traders and the individuals who are into this kind of a rice milling, whenever they will go and purchase the goods, which is the rice and other kinds of ingredients required, they will be subjected to 5% cess. Is this a tax or a fee? One response is it is a tax. What about it being a fee? Because fees, we are understanding that there is this kind of a movement which has happened. So I've got the other response also in support that it is a tax. The reason being, sorry. The other response is that it is a fees because it is for a specific purpose. And while there is no quid pro quo, there is a casual relationship which exists. Response is that it is a fees. Other one is that it could be a regulatory and compensatory fees in the new sense of terms. It is a fees. Casual indirect relationship may be established, right? As per the Amarnath case, this is a general benefit, so it is a fees. Yeah. Right, so this is exactly the kind of the difference that you've made the moment you expanded the scope of a fees, right? You are saying that even if as rice millers you will be receiving not a specific kind of a privilege but as a part of a general populace, right? The fact that storage facilities will increase, the rural roads and bridges will improvise, this will bring some benefit to you. So the payment which you are making, there is a quid pro quo, not a direct one, mind you, but a casual one is also sufficient for this levy to be upheld as a fees. Hmm. So, in that sense of terms, then what is the distinction that we are left with between a tax and a fee? Is there a real distinction which exists? Because that is also something which is very critical, for these kinds of conceptualizings. Yes, there are all these other comments also that infrastructure creation and development is also something which will be funded by the proceeds of tax, right? So then why is it not that this is a tax? Because see, creating roads, bridges, storage facilities, that's what even taxpayers' monies is used for, right? So then aren't you blurring that distinction between a tax and a fees? Okay, one of the reasons behind this kind of a levy and the fees as the nomenclature being used was cess was the charge which the petitioners had put against the state government was that back then there was Sales Tax Act and the Central Sales Tax Act. Central Sales Tax Act within those notified commodities did not allow the governments to exceed 4% of tax because of the fact that they had already reached that 4% tax limit. To circumvent that limitation, the state government had imposed this levy as a cess and tried to get it classified as a fees and not as a tax, right? So always remember, behind all these kinds of disputes there will be some kind of a parallel theme which is running, and because they couldn't have subjected these these fees payer, these rice milling owners and the individuals and traders into any further sales tax or purchase tax, the charge was that hence they have come up with this new idea to nomenclature it as a cess, right? However, we have also got a very standard understanding that the nomenclature of the levy is not really indicative of the nature of the levy, right? So, apart from that, measure of the levy does not determine its essential character. We now also, in the light of this, tax versus fees conundrum, have this understanding and a very standard line taken that nomenclature of a levy is not determinative of its nature, right? So the imposing authority may name it as a fees, as a cess, as a tax, but in essence, it could be, one or the other. We will continue with this discussion in our next class when we meet, where we are further trying to, we'll further deepen the discussion as well as the controversy.